Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time is a revelation, an answer to a question over a decade pending. What's next for Crash Bandicoot? To the uninitiated, that sentiment might seem like a no-brainer. Crash 4 is a sequel. What is its purpose, if not to follow up on the ongoing tales of its titular character? Well, to discuss that, allow me to provide some much-needed context. Crash Bandicoot was created in 1994 by childhood friends Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin, co-founders of what would go on to become the world-renowned game studio Naughty Dog. The character was designed by artist Charles Zembilas, and initially nicknamed Willy the Wombat as a placeholder, before being revised into the iconic Bandicoot we know today. Crash was supposed to be a PlayStation mascot, Sony's answer to the likes of Mario or Sonic.
Fine, but I'm not wearing pants!
Of course, he was one of several answers. The early 90s saw a massive boom in mascot-led platformers. But our favorite marsupial somehow crashed through the noise. The franchise found great success with a trilogy of tight, well-designed, and incredibly charming games: Crash Bandicoot, Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back, and Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped. On his blog, Gavin cites that the gameplay drew influence from Mario and Donkey Kong Country. The animation and general sense of humor were inspired by Looney Tunes and the cartoons of Tex Avery. You had this evil scientist, Dr. Neo Cortex, and his team of knuckleheads mutating animals left and right to serve under their command. The end goal? World domination. But alas, the Doctor's insidious would always be thwarted by Cortex's greatest failure, his greatest regret, the iconic and mischievous Bandicoot we know today. Joining Crash on his adventures were his whiz-kid sister Coco, and their mentor, a mask named Aku Aku. Other characters included Crash's love interest Tawna, who was written out after the first game, and Cortex's rogues gallery of co-conspirators, each of whom was uniquely designed, uniquely motivated, and uniquely characterized. Crash had a colorful cast in every sense of the word, so where better to go after 3 widely successful platformers than a kart racing spin-off? Naughty Dog released Crash Team Racing in 1999, and it was, yet again, a triumph. Now you could play as not only Crash and Coco, but Cortex and Engine and Tiny and Dingodile, and a host of other quirky classic characters too. Couple that with the deeply satisfying drift boosting mechanic, and you had on your hands a Wumpa-fueled bonanza, a winning formula! By all metrics, Crash Bandicoot as a series should have continued to thrive, and it did, but never quite in the same way. You see, while Naughty Dog created the games and Sony published them, the IP was owned by Universal Interactive, and their relationship with Naughty Dog had turned contentious in recent years. Naughty Dog's devs recognized this and had, in fact, already moved on to their next title, Jak and Daxter for the upcoming PS2. Universal figured, hey, Crash is successful, why keep limiting him to one console? And so they sent the beloved Bandicoot everywhere. Our hero crashed his way onto the PS2, the Xbox, the Game Boy Advance. Traveler's Tales developed the 4th mainline platformer, Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex, under Universal's leadership, and released it in 2001. Here they introduced a 3rd Bandicoot sibling to the mix, Crunch, who starts out as Cortex's new right hand and challenges you to several fights throughout the game. In each battle, Crunch would harness the powers of one of 4 elemental masks, something we'll revisit shortly, but by the end of the game, he came to realize that Cortex was in the wrong. Crunch redeemed himself and allied himself with Crash and Coco at the end. And from there, he went on to become a recurring main character. In 2004, the team released its next mainline platformer, Crash Twinsanity, which broke away from the hub-based level select of past games and opened up the world. The result was my favorite entry since Warped. Twinsanity told a more ambitious story that saw Crash and Cortex being forced to team up in a dimension-hopping buddy comedy adventure.
Once, they were mortal enemies. Now they're teaming up. And they're still mortal enemies.
Twinsanity also upped the ante on the series' goofiness and sense of humor.
My crystals!
And last but not least, it introduced yet another principal and playable character, Nina Cortex. Our own Neo Cortex is
My daughter, niece!
Together, the three embarked on a journey that saw them traveling to a twisted mirror dimension, complete with an evil Crash. Only, the devs wanted to use this premise to even greater effect. They were tragically held back by time and budget constraints. And we'll revisit this detail too. But enough of that. This video is about Crash 4. Why recap this 20-something odd years of history? Well, Wrath of Cortex and Twinsanity were kind of the original attempts at a Crash 4, and they weren't even half the story. When I say Universal put Crash everywhere, I do mean everywhere, to the point that if you were to ask a sample of people what the last mainline Crash game was, you could end up with wildly different answers. Crash 3 was the last one by Naughty Dog, Team Racing if you count the racers. Wrath of Cortex was the last to use the classic Crash formula. Twinsanity, the last to be a true platformer that endeavored to evolve the series further. And then there was Tag Team Racing, the last we saw their classic iterations on a wacky, fun adventure that brought together platforming with racing. And last but not least, we had Crash of the Titans and Mind Over Mutant, a series of beat-em-up adventures starring redesigned versions of Crash and Coco. All of these answers would be valid, all of them could be wrong, it didn't matter. Crash Bandicoot was never about the story, but it was about a colorful, crazed ensemble of characters who were suddenly, anticlimactically, retired for almost a decade. And the question, what's next for Crash Bandicoot, lingered, only the answer was multiple choice. Here we had a multiversal range of interpretations, and you'd get points no matter which choice you went with. So when Vicarious Visions revived the series with a remake of the original trilogy in 2017, all bets were off. Crash was back. Classic Crash. Revamped and redesigned for a new generation. Beenox followed this up with a remake of CTR in 2019, and they did something unexpected on top of it. They folded in this multiversal, conflicted set of canons into the game. You can play as Crunch. You can play as Nina. You can even play as Pasadena and Rillaru and Megamix. Characters from the most obscure corner of the series' history were fair game, and Beenox didn't release them all at once either. What we got was a series of monthly updates, new characters, new tracks, and Easter eggs referencing just about every facet of Crash's history. And these Easter eggs kept fans guessing, kept them excited. What beloved character would we see next? And moreover, if Crunch and Nina were back in remake form, would we see them folded into the main series too? CTR Nitro Fueled was a true celebration of the series, faults and all, and it was so because through its roster, through its level design, through its heaps of loving Easter eggs, it dared to embrace the wild range of interpretations of Crash Bandicoot's canon that series fans have held across the years. If not a multiverse game, it was, at least in some sense, a multiverse-affirming one.
And as a final show of good faith, I've asked our engineers to create some of the finest hovercrafts on this side of the galaxy.
Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time picks up right where the events of the third game left off, 22 long years ago. Narratively, it acts as if none of the in-between games happened. The number 4 signifies that, hey, this is it! This is the true Naughty Dog style sequel you've been waiting for. It's about time. But it's also about space, and about matter, and about gravity. You see, Crash and Coco are joined this time by 4 reality-warping quantum masks.
So where's the next mask?
Characters reminiscent of the elemental masks of Wrath of Cortex, who ask for their help in sealing the rifts between dimensions. Now, recall Twinsanity. Crash 4 is also a dimension-hopping game in which our heroes chase Cortex and his goons across different realities. And, spoiler alert, it too is a game that sees Crash and Cortex eventually teaming up. These are just some of the most obvious callbacks to previous titles, but far from the only ones. I wanted to emphasize the series' history up front, because Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time could not have existed without the specific set of circumstances that led us to its conception. Corporate conflicts, falling outs, scrapped ambitions, and all. Crash 4 It's About Time is as much about lost time and what remnants get salvaged, as it is about our time with Crash going forward. This may chronologically be the 4th Crash game, but it is not shy about the fact that it was a long road to get here, with plenty of scrapped attempts in the process.
Wow, I'm sensing a real fraught history here. How many times have you beaten this clown anyway?
3.
Really? Only 3? Funny. Seemed like more.
It is not shy about the fact that a multiversal adventure feels like the only route it could conceivably have taken, after marinating in this confused limbo state for so long. In ways vastly reminiscent of CTR Nitro Fueled, it's about time buries inside jokes, Easter eggs, and nods to the series' scrapped history in its levels' backgrounds. The result is a world that feels simultaneously like a direct follow-up to the events of Crash 1 through 3, yet also one with a remarkably complex lore that stretches past the confines of the game itself and into metatextual territory. It is a fascinating but strange act to balance. To me, who has explored and even loved many of the in-between games, it doesn't feel like Crash 4 period. It feels like Crash 4 version 4 Final Draft 3.exe. And to be clear, it is one hell of a polished, perfected final draft.
One thing that we did to ground these new environments and experiences was to make sure that we sprinkled in a bunch of Easter eggs throughout the game. Made sure that there's enough detailed for eagle-eyed fans, but also to tap into the richness of the IP that didn't get an opportunity in the main storyline, or just it would have been too crammed if we tried to pull in all of the interesting characters and then tell a compelling story of it.
The game does everything in its power, successfully, I think, to earn its title, that heavy fated number 4. I cannot praise the gameplay enough for how many clever twists it introduces while preserving the core appeal of the series. It is easily the best gameplay we've had since Warped. The addition of Cortex, Dingodile, and an alternate reality Tawna as playable characters only heightens this appeal. Crash and Coco are playable in every major level with identical movesets. But these 3? They're specialized, baby. Tawna has an acrobatic flair, a roundhouse kick, and a grappling hook mechanic that make her my favorite, most unexpected addition to the game. She's a joy to play as, and her backstory reveals she lost Crash and Coco in her original universe.
What did we, die or something?
What? No! Nope.
No, definitely not. So how are things in your dimension?
Dingodile is a retired restaurant owner now, trying to find his way back home. He's traded in his flamethrower for a new weapon reminiscent of the suck cannon from Ratchet and Clank. I found his quote-unquote redemption to be remarkably funny. Intentional or not, it reminded me of his role in Crash Bash, when Uka Uka just swapped him into Crash's team for the sake of convenience. Last but not least, Cortex has an air dash and a blaster that can turn enemies into gelatinous platforms. His sections weren't always my cup of tea, but this did allow for them to have a great deal of versatility I appreciated.
Hang on, guys, I'm coming!
But with all of that being said, here is my one complaint with Crash Bandicoot 4. I wanted its story to be as playful, as inventive as its gameplay, and it just wasn't. And that's fine. Like with the cartoons that inspired it, I don't come to Crash Bandicoot for the story, but I do come to it for its cast of characters.
It's funny how history repeats itself.
Theoretically, this is a multiverse game, and the appeal of a setting like that is seeing familiar figures in new, reimagined designs and situations. For all the scope and grandiosity such a concept entails, I think what the best multiverse stories do is razor in on the very small, human question of, what if? Crash 4's close contemporary Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart does this heart and soul, but It's About Time only really asks what if about 2 of its characters. There's a great deal of environmental storytelling and world building going on through gameplay, don't get me wrong, but when it comes to the main overarching plot, its biggest surprise is saved for a final act that ignores the multiversal travel and zeroes in on time travel instead. Perhaps part of the reason I felt let down by this is that I'd seen it done before, within the series. Twinsanity managed to be a wacky, world-hopping romp that expanded the narrative range of the series without taking itself too seriously. If anything, it did so by taking itself less seriously. I also mentioned Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled earlier on in this video. Crash 4 takes cues from Nitro Fueled in its level design. There are so many Easter eggs, and there's so much storytelling work going on in the backgrounds here, reminiscent of the animated, atmospheric tracks from the beloved kart racer. But in CTR, the newer tracks also came in tandem with new skins, reimagining beloved characters in altered, thematically appropriate forms. At times, they even came with wacky, character-based story premises. What if Fake Crash got hold of Entropy's staff and turned back time to the dinosaur age? What if a Mad Max-esque apocalypse ravaged Rue's tubes in a world ruled by Megamix? This latter track, Megamix Mania for instance, was probably the biggest foreshadowing towards Crash 4, which houses a similar wasteland world. And yet, the imaginative, apocalyptic wasteland versions of characters that you unlock through it are exclusive to CTR. I'm not saying I want these exact designs imported into Crash 4. I'm happy with the selection of skins you get for Crash and Coco throughout this title. But I'm saying these CTR skins and reimaginings spark something in my brain about the Elseworlds of these characters in a way that Crash 4 cares very little about. Its main narrative only endeavors to capture the question of what if twice, and I do respect that. But it complicates its ambitions by repeating CTR's style of storytelling, without electing to move any of it forwards, without making any of the Crash Bandicoot mythos it references in its background actual existing mythos, without playing with new versions of characters in place of the ones we already know and love, or hate, or love to hate. This isn't a bad thing.
Now, internally, this was being described as a reboot, which suggests a really drastic overhaul, and perhaps that was a term that was being used prematurely.
On the contrary, I find it to be a fascinating approach to acknowledging all that came before. I just wonder how many games Toys for Bob, or Beanox, or whoever comes next can keep it up for.
Internally, this was being described as a reboot.
I'm thrilled to live in the dimension in which this version of Crash 4 It's About Time exists. And if that means giving up some of my hopes for what the game's story could have been, I'm happy to live with that compromise. By being selective about when and where it remixes its past, the game gets to go all in on its present, on its moment-to-moment gameplay, and all the wonder, wilderness, and whoa new enemies that come with it. It is the worthiest Crash sequel in a long time, a true Crash Bandicoot 4 that, simultaneously, paradoxically, owes so much to all the other attempts at Crash 4 that have happened before. I'm not convinced it could have existed had Wrath of Cortex and Twinsanity, and even the various spin-offs not tried new things before it. But now that it does, I feel pretty good about saying that Crash Bandicoot It's About Time is a Crash Bandicoot It's About Time is a revelation, an answer to a question over a decade pending. What's next for Crash Bandicoot? To the uninitiated, that sentiment might seem like a no-brainer. It's About Time is a reboot. What is its purpose if not to modernize, recontextualize, revitalize the tale of its titular character? Well, to discuss that, allow me to provide some much-needed context. Crash Bandicoot was created in 1994 by childhood friends Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin. Artist Charles Zambelas, initially nicknamed Willy the Wombat as a placeholder. The IP was owned by Universal Interactive, and their relationship with Naughty Dog had turned contentious in recent years. Rumors of a Crash Bandicoot remake first sparked when PlayStation's Sean Layden showed up to PSX 2015 in a Crash Bandicoot t-shirt, only to not announce anything relating to the orange marsupial. It wouldn't be until a full year later that Activision would announce Crash Bandicoot It's About Time. Not a remake, but a series reboot, slated to reintroduce Crash & Co. to a next generation. The developer's vicarious visions promised a greater emphasis on story that would, quote, align more closely with market expectations for modern single-player games. It's About Time was going to combine the stories of older Crash games into one, singular, new definitive origin story for our favorite Bandicoot.
What we did was we put the term reboot on one end of the spectrum, which suggests reinvention. And then on the other end, we explored this idea of a sequel, which suggests an evolution of ideas or a continuation.
Truth be told, I was incredibly excited by this back in 2016. The developers even mentioned they were following advice from Andy Gavin, who had told them in 2013, Crash needs a total reboot. There is an opportunity to reset the history and go back to his creation story and the original conflict with Cortex. In that context, one could reprise classic Crash 1 and 2 settings and villains. However, Gavin never officially signed on to write on the project. He opted to focus on his books and screenwriting career, stating he'd only return to games if he could make his dream dungeon crawler someday. A few months later, it was announced It's About Time would pull in story beats from more than just Crash 1 through 3. Over time, my excitement slowly warped into skepticism. Through all these years, no one had managed to match Naughty Dog's original trilogy's tight, crunchy gameplay. Who was to say this new origin, one that sought to take the place of the old, could be any different? Of course, now that I have the game in my hands, there arises the million wampa question. Did they pull it off? I was generously provided an advance review copy from Activision, so quick forward. I can't show you footage of everything, but I'm going to talk full spoilers and disclose some of the changes you might want to be aware of. 1. Both of Crash's siblings, Coco and Crunch Bandicoot, appear as playable characters in this game. That means Crunch is now a part of Crash's origin story. 2. Uka Uka is already working with Cortex from the beginning, and Aku Aku recruits Crash, believing they can stop Cortex and his evil brother together. 3. Aku's friends appear in this game, 3 masks who each bond with a different Bandicoot sibling and grant them unique abilities to help with platforming. Crash can phase in and out certain objects, Coco can slow time, and Crunch can activate a powerful dark spin to helicopter leap great distances. 4. In an effort to modernize Papu Papu and avoid perpetuating harmful stereotypes, I mean, it's 2018, right folks? Papu is now an ally with a speaking role, not a boss fight. 5. For similar reasons, Donna Bandicoot is no longer Crash's girlfriend or a damsel in distress. Here, she's reimagined as an independent hero and Crash's unrequited crush. And finally, 6. Nina Cortex also features in this reimagining, as a key character from the very beginning. In fact, the story is this. Skip to this timestamp if you don't want to know. Young Nina is graduating from the Academy of Evil, and her uncle, iconic antagonist Dr. Neocortex, needs to get her a graduation present. He decides he's going to show up his family by gifting her the literal world, but his mentor Uka Uka reins him in. He points out that the world should be his. You buffoon! And Nina can have, maybe, I don't know, an island? So to take over the Wampa Islands, Cortex sets about abducting and mutating animals to turn them into an army under his command. Aiding him in his quest is the ancient mask Uka Uka and their evil scientist subordinates N Jin and N Brio. With all this context established, the game throws us into our tutorial. Crash Bandicoot is Cortex's latest creation. A young Bandicoot freshly mutated by Evolvo Ray, slated to act as Cortex's army general. Instead of opening on the beach like the original Crash Bandicoot, It's About Time now opens with Crash training under Cortex.
Yes, the crates are meant to be broken. They were placed as an impenetrable barrier. I'll redesign the other tests.
And I actually really love this change. It's a great introduction to the series' signature smashing crates mechanic. The devs don't just show us what the differences are between different types of crates, but also how crate placement in It's About Time will require strategic jumps, backtracking, and planning. And we're given the space to learn it all without any interfering enemies. Following this tutorial, we encounter our first foes, moments before Crash breaks away and makes his grand escape. Upon fleeing Cortex Castle, Crash finds himself crash landing in the woods, where a mask named Aku Aku takes him in.
Crash! Quickly, we must go!
Aku guides him to a tribal village you might all recognize, one which now acts as the game's main hub. It's run by Chief Papu Papu, your new ally who reveals that many of his subordinates have been possessed by the evil mask Uka Uka. Aku tells Crash that Uka is his brother and the two have been broiled in a conflict of good versus evil for centuries. Fearing Uka and Cortex's impending stranglehold on the islands, Crash and Aku make a truce to work together and gather the 5 bandicoots who may be able to help stop them. So, yeah, that's the premise. Over the course of the next few levels, Crash sets off on a mission to rescue the other 4 bandicoots, while the village acts as a hub you can return to. He arrives upon boss fights that pay homage to fights from the original trilogy, and rescues his sister Coco Bandicoot first from Ripperoo, his brother Crunch Bandicoot from, well, evil mind control, and finally Tawna Bandicoot from Pinstripe Potoru. The Pinstripe fight's a big highlight, because Crash daydreams about the ending of the 1996 original before he's snapped back to reality. Tawna isn't interested in him. In fact, she didn't even need rescuing. She'd charmed Pinstripe into betraying Cortex and running away with her. With Pinstripe incapacitated, you've ruined her plans. Great job, gamers. So Tawna agrees to help the Bandicoot siblings take the fight to Cortex. She commandeers Pinstripe's blimp and pilots us right into the belly of the beast, Cortex Castle. At this stage, Crash, Coco, and Crunch storm the castle from different directions, facing unique obstacles along the path, with it all culminating in Crash, separated from his siblings, being pitted against a double feature of a boss fight, against Cortex's most powerful, capable 2 mutants. Meet series mainstays Tiny Tiger and Dingodile. Again, the battles pay homage to their PS1 originals, and when Crash shocks everyone by coming out on top, the castle starts to collapse in on itself. Coco and Crunch reunite with Crash amidst the chaos and escape. Or do they?
Crash, is that you?
Back at Papu's village, Coco obsesses over the fact that they never quite found the 5th Bandicoot, and it's only then that she realizes they never reunited with Crash. They escaped with an imposter, a joke character longtime fans will recognize as, well, fake Crash, the 5th Bandicoot. Horrified she left her brother behind, Coco vows to return to the ruins of Cortex Castle. And it's at this point we come back to find Crash training under Cortex again. Only this time the puzzles are harder, and the stakes higher, putting to the test everything you've learned across the past 15 hours or so. It's around this time that Nina arrives at her uncle's castle, only to find it almost in ruins. And when she meets Crash, she tells her uncle she doesn't want the island, she wants a pet. She wants the Bandicoot. Cortex is annoyed by this, so he tells her no, so Nina ends up setting Crash free of his mind control and leading him on a playful chase through the castle grounds. The rest of the story is pretty straightforward from here. Coco and Crunch arrive to the rescue, Cortex and his top scientists try to get payback, and you end by fighting N-Jin as Coco, N Brio as Crunch, and of course, N Cortex himself as Crash.
Crash Bandicoot! It's about time!
With the island saved and Uka Uka banished, our Bandicoot friends save Papu's tribe and make a home for themselves out on the beach. Nina also adopts fake Crash as her own. Believe it or not, I quite enjoyed this series of events. I thought they were a smart way to mix and modernize a lot of Crash's series history, but by the end of it, I found myself wishing the game was as inventive with its gameplay as it was with its story. The Bandicoot masks are an excellent idea building on what came before from Wrath of Cortex, and they're incorporated into the gameplay in a really intriguing, often challenging way. It's a wonderful evolution of the core systems that made those original Naughty Dog games so satisfying. But it's also rarely used in a balanced way. Basically, you are going to be using Crash's ability way more than you will Coco or Crunch's. The siblings have far fewer levels, and even when they do, Crunch, who I'm not allowed to show much footage of, plays bordering on sluggish. Coco is fast, fun, and snappy, but aside from her ability, she doesn't play all that different from Crash. It's About Time is wonderful, and probably the best Crash since the Naughty Dog age, but it's also missing something. Those original titles were tight, narrow, and linear, but going by modern industry trends, It's About Times are more loose, more open. One of the massive downsides of this is that some crates end up absurdly difficult to find, and that isn't the kind of difficulty players come to Crash for. Because here's the other tragic piece. The game isn't terribly difficult or replayable. Other than a gem for getting all crates, and the classic time trial feature, there's rarely motivation to go back and master any other aspects of levels. Remember the death routes? Or the color gems? All of that is gone now. The experience has become somehow simultaneously both too open on a level-by-level basis and too linear, with little to no reason to go back on a macro basis. And I can't help but wonder if some of this could have been avoided if...
Why did you I have to choose a Bandicoot. If I just stuck with the Wombat, this all could have been different.
If the devs had gone back and studied the original trilogy just a tad more. They do a stellar job of looking to the past, but at times it feels like they're looking at just too many pasts, you know? I don't begrudge them for trying something new, but with so many failed attempts at a Crash sequel over the years, I just wanted the game to be a little bit more. But luckily, there is an extremely solid foundation here, and I think the future is bright for new Crash Bandicoot games. You might say, it's about time. Willy the Wombat 4 It's About Time is a revelation. An answer to a question over a decade pending. What's next for Willy the Wombat? To the uninitiated, that sentiment might seem like a no-brainer. Willy 4 is a sequel. Created in 1994 by childhood friends Charles Zambilas and initially nicknamed Willy the Wombat as a placeholder until executives at Sony latched onto the name and insisted it was snappy, succinct, and marketable. Gavin and company tried to push back, wanting to come up with something more unique, but Universal and Sony pressured them into keeping Willy as Willy. Guess executive meddling has its benefits sometimes, huh? Willy went on to become an iconic PlayStation mascot in the 90s, finding great success through a duology of niche, but tight, well-designed games. Joining him in his adventures were his whiz-kid sister Wanda Wombat and his love interest, Pamela Potoru. However, the relationship between Naughty Dog and Universal had started to turn contentious in recent years. So when Vicarious Visions revived the series with a remake of the original trilogy in 2017, and yes, even the disappointing third game with some new improvements, all bets were off. Willy was back, classic Willy, revamped and redesigned for a new generation. Now, hot on the heels of his resurgence, Willy has a brand new game, designed from the ground up by developers Toys for Bob. Willy the Wombat 4 It's About Time follows through on a scrapped concept for Willy 3, a game which had originally been planned to be about our iconic Wombat friends time traveling, until it was reassigned from Naughty Dog to Traveler's Tales, who made it a standard modern day setting entry again. In our latest entry, he's approached by a cyborg version of Wanda from the future, who warns Willy that at some point between today and 20 years into the future, their nemesis Cortex will have successfully taken over the world and turned it into a dystopia devoid of color. Willy follows this alternate version of his sister through time, making pit stops at various time periods, and restoring color to the cosmos as he goes. It's a unique, visually exciting take on classic platforming, and its smart modernization. Willy never got the same amount of space to experiment with fun, fresh art styles and concepts that his close contemporary Mario did. It's About Time is his first spin at something a bit more experimental, and I'd consider this experiment a success. Together, Willy and Wanda join with a band of pirates on a time-traveling pirate ship, helmed by none other than Pamela herself.
Hang on, guys, I'm coming!
All three act as playable characters throughout the campaign, with their own unique movesets and abilities. Seeing these familiar faces redesigned in the context of an alternate future is genuinely thrilling. While I won't pretend I come to Willy the Wombat games for the story, I'd be lying if I said I didn't find myself coming back for the characters. Old favorites like Cortex's henchmen return as primary antagonists.
We have a thing where we fight, he loses. It's a well-established dynamic.
But there's new villains too. Pulling once more from Naughty Dog's own scrapped concepts, Toys for Bob introduces two new antagonists, the Doctor's Entropy,
Let's see what you Mongols can do as a pack.
whose sole purpose is to keep the timeline and stop any time travel shenanigans from going too far. They force Willy and Cortex's gangs into an uneasy alliance, maintaining that any divergence from the primary timeline could have catastrophic consequences for all involved, the likes of which we can only imagine. Super Mario It's About Time is a revelation, an answer to a question over a decade pending. What's next for Super Mario? To the uninitiated, that sentiment might seem like a no-brainer. Mario 4 is a sequel. What is its purpose if not to follow up on the ongoing tales of its eponymous character? Well, to discuss that, allow me to provide some much-needed context. Mario was created in 1981 by Japanese game developer Shigeru Miyamoto, who had recently started out as an apprentice at what would go on to become the world-renowned game studio Nintendo. The character was initially nicknamed Mr. Video as a placeholder, before being revised into the iconic plumber we know today. Miyamoto states that the initial influences for the character were the Popeye cartoons and the comics of E.C. Seeger. The concept of Donkey Kong was inspired by, unsurprisingly, King Kong.
Why do I always have to start the day with a tough decision?
Unfortunately, Mario's popularity and name recognition were fated to dwindle over the next several decades. After finding great success through a trilogy of tight, well-designed 2D platformers, the plumber was slated to make his jump to 3D with the N64 title Super Mario 64. But the relationship between Miyamoto and Nintendo had turned contentious in recent years. His and his team's eventual departure from the company forced Nintendo's hand. They reassigned the development of Mario 64 to a third-party partner. But no one had ever made a strong 3D platformer before. The dev team was at a loss. Would it be fun, or even engaging, to play a game where you stared at your player character's butt the whole time? As it turns out, there was a similar game in development around the same time. US game studio Naughty Dog was developing Crash Bandicoot 3D, a sequel to the popular Crash Bandicoot platformer games that had taken the PlayStation 1 by storm. Side note, did you know that the Japanese Crash Bandicoot 2 was originally a game called Aku Aku Panic that was just reskinned into a Crash game? The actual Crash 2 was never formally released in Japan because it was deemed too easy for Japanese markets, though it would eventually find its way there years later under the title Crash Bandicoot: The Lost Levels. Anyway, the success of Crash 3D forced Nintendo to give Mario 64 another push, and they took what was originally conceptualized as an open-ended, explorable game and turned it into something more linear, akin to Crash. While this still resulted in a solid, genre-defining game, ironically, the Crash games would actually go on to open up their worlds over the next few years, and Mario ended up dragging behind. When Universal tried to wrestle the Crash IP out of Sony and PlayStation's hands, Sony decided to hold on to him as their mascot, and so, through a landmark deal, they arranged to keep Crash under their original developers, and to continue to develop his games in several cool new experimental genres, contexts, and art styles. Nintendo's efforts weren't quite as fruitful.
The truth is obvious. The guilty party sits among us. It is none other than Mario!
Objection! Overruled. I judge the defendant guilty as charged.
Mario was supposed to be Nintendo's mascot, but he never quite caught up with Donkey Kong. Still, a niche but passionate fanbase formed around the small-time plumber, hailing him as a humble, working-class hero that the world needed to see more of. 64 was followed by a sequel that garnered lukewarm reception, Super Mario 128, and though Nintendo tried to promote him through various other spin-offs and... But enough about that. This video is about Mario 4. Why recap this 40-odd years of history? Well, It's About Time is special because Nintendo patched things up with and rehired several of the key developers who worked on Mario 64 and the original trilogy, Miyamoto himself included. In return, these devs have brought back their experiences from working with a wide variety of games and platformers across the years. The game is an amalgamation of these experiences, a collective supernova of ideas from all over the gaming landscape, brought back to a series that inspired so much of that landscape, but never quite got the recognition for it that it deserved. I recap the series' history up front because now, years later, we are finally getting to see the creative vision for Mario 64 that we never got to see. But built on top of that vision is years of gaming history, years of platforming greatness, inspired by Mario, paying it back to Mario just in time for his grand revival. It's About Time could not have existed without the specific set of circumstances that led us to its conception. Cancellations, corporate fallouts, competition, and all. Mario 4 It's About Time picks up right where the events of Mario 3 left off. Narratively, it acts as if none of the in-between games happened. That number 4 signifies that, hey, this is it! This is the true Miyamoto-style 3D sequel you've been waiting for. It's about time. But it's also about space. and about matter, and about gravity. You see, Mario is on a quest across the cosmos this time, in a battle to stop his nemesis Bowser from getting away with kidnapping Princess Peach. Each planet he visits has its own gravitational rules and physics, and it's a unique, visually exciting take on classic platforming. But make no mistake, this is a game that is as much about Mario's history as it is about our time with the Plumber going forward. It expands the scope of the series from revolving around kingdoms to revolving around galaxies, with each galaxy acting as its own fun spin on different platforming mechanics developers have played with over the years. You even get to play as a wide range of new characters from these galaxies, each with their own abilities. By extension, the game is not just a celebration of Mario, but of the history of platforming as a whole, but it's also smart, future-forward modernization. Mario did not get the same amount of space to mess around with fun, fresh art styles and concepts that his close contemporary Crash Bandicoot did. It's About Time is his first jump at something more experimental, and I'd consider this experiment a success. Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Space is a Coco Bandicoot 4 That's So Sketch is an assault on the eye. Hello, is this thing on? Naughty Dog's Crash Bandicoot 4 The Precursor Legacy is a groovy showcase for what the all-new PlayStation 2 can... A revelation. An answer to a question over a decade... Does Spyro Team Racing live up to Mario Kart? Crash Bandicoot 4 Atomic Comic is a revelation. Crash vs. Cortex Race to Atlantis is a... Sony reassigned the franchise to... Gorilla Cambridge, Sucker Punch, Insomniac Games, who'd been complaining there was nowhere new left for Spyro to go since he didn't have any hands, and therefore couldn't wield weapons. But Crash somehow crashed through the... Crash Bandicoot the movie is a revelation. An answer to a... Spyro's Dungeon 12 is a revelation. An answer to a question over a decade pending. What's next for Spyro the Dragon? To the uninitiated, that sentiment might seem like a no-brainer. Spyro 12 is a sequel to a popular tabletop game. What is its purpose if not to... Hang on, gotta pick a card. One sec. Be grateful for what you have. In another life, you might not have had it. Recover 3 health and deal 0.5 damage to an opponent of your choosing. Okay. Oh, you wanna go?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, let's see here. Remember, true optimism is the belief that even that which you love has the capacity to be better. Deal 8 damage to an opponent of your choosing. Does anyone have shield up?
Dice, please. Thanks. Okay, here goes. Another card. Okay, let's see. Oh, huh.
What?
Does anyone know this character?
Oh no, weird. He must be a new guy.
Yeah, weird. I like his design though. Lot of character.
Okay, he gives me an experience boost? I don't know, it's hard to read. Okay, whose turn's next?
I think it's them.
Hey, bud, do you recognize who this character is?
Crash Bandicoot is...